So this is Oliver Traldi, prolific writer and editor of a variety of magazines, online and in print.
Not, I don't think I've been in print yet.
No,
Uh, for one reason or another, it's not a priority for me.
yeah.
I like to be in this kind of roiling, constant conversation that we have online. And print is so, I don't even know who reads it anymore.
Sluggish people.
Um,
Well,
I
I
guess
guess they don't even provide magazines at toilets anymore because it's just assumed that you have your device on you.
you'll have your phone. If you reading is what you want to do there, you'll have your phone, you'll have your Kindle. You're all set.
So, what would you say well, I guess there's kind of two, it's kind of a double prong question, but what's your area of expertise? And then what's your area of interest with your authorship?
Yeah, so I would say I study philosophy. I'm going to be starting a PhD program in 2 months at Notre Dame in philosophy, and I view myself, in one sense or another, as bringing um, the elements of good philosophy to some of these more public conversations. So one of those, of course, is analytical rigor. Is making sure that people are people are making honest arguments that actually, follow logically and so forth, or follow in whatever the appropriate way is. Could be an inductive argument or could be somebody's making an inference to the best explanation, which is the type of argument that I spend the most time studying. And the other part is, I see philosophy as a discipline where there's a great deal of openness and I mean that in the subject matter, not necessarily in the kind of the academic politics of it. That's a whole other story. Um, but kind of by nature, philosophy asks you to think about, well, isn't it metaphysically possible that tomorrow everything could be made of cheese? And you have to think, well, maybe, yeah, maybe there's a sense in which that's possible. Or, like, isn't it, in meta ethics, you ask, well, is there really right and wrong at all to begin with? Is anything really right or wrong? So these very, very broad questions that get at the foundations of what we think. And one of the things I've been writing about recently is just in public philosophy, like in the Stone in the New York Times, for instance. These features are just not really well reflected in the kind of public writings of philosophers. And I think one of the reasons for the rise of what they've been calling this intellectual dark web is, although I don't think any of the main figures kind of embody both of these things at once. You do have kind of on the Sam Harris side, you have an incredibly curious person. On the Ben Shapiro side, you have somebody who's always you see all these videos, like eviscerated by logic or whatever, and that's kind of like logic does eviscerate things to a certain extent. I don't know if Ben Shapiro eviscerates things, but Socrates eviscerated things. That was what you did. You went to Socrates and you said, Socrates, I think I know what the good is, and he said, you know, take a step back, son. And the other thing is, with the Jordan Peterson side of it, you see this other theme of philosophy, which is kind of helping people find meaning to a certain degree, which is, philosophy in recent years, I think, has found a lot of difficulty with that. The existentialists obviously grappled with this a great deal, with the difficulty of finding meaning in the modern world. But yeah, so I guess that's a roundabout way of saying, in my public writing, I think of myself as attempting to be a public philosopher of one type or another.
And engaging with ideas and showing weak spots in arguments and finding the good parts of arguments, even that you disagree with, and building them up, or
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, one thing, kind of on every side of. I mean, I mostly write about politics because that's where the arguments are, right? I like to find arguments in the wild, so to speak. I don't like to cook them up at home in the lab. I'm kind of a, the ecological arguments, out in the world. The empirical thing of arguments. And so I tend to write a lot about politics because that's where people are doing the most arguing. But it's also an area where people are the least inclined to say, oh, like, I disagree with this person, but I learned something from their way of framing this, or, oh, this is a good start that my opponent has made. Let me build on it, or something like that. And so a lot of the things we prize um, in argumentation, a certain kind of charity in the broad sense, not in the narrow kind of interpretive sense of what's called the principle of charity, but just kind of the generosity and friendliness of argumentation is often missing in these realms. Um, so it's a kind of unique place to be looking at arguments, and that's what I see myself as doing.
You brought up when you were talking just now about Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, and then Jordan Peterson. You said something about Jordan Peterson attempting or working on building up meaning in the modern world. And I see that even though he attacks, or he has this polemic against what he calls postmodernism, he's still, I think that postmodernism and what he's doing is still engaged in a similar project of giving meaning that maybe not surpasses, but doesn't wholly rely on very strictly analytic methods.
Yeah, so Peterson is Peterson is an interesting figure in a lot of these ways. He's a Jungian, and Quillette now has published, even without much reference to Peterson, is publishing these defenses of Carl Jung, which is a little bit kind of off their beaten path, I would say. I got into this whole area kind of partly through the replication crisis in psychology and things like that. I don't know how well Jung fares in the replication crisis, or whether he even makes claims that are testable, per se. I'm not an expert. I would say Peterson is an interesting figure. There's something, for some reason on Twitter, I ended up following a lot of Catholics and being followed by a lot of Catholics. So the Catholics have a very interesting view on Peterson. I think they're actually very torn. Um, some of them very much like his project because he has a kind of religiosity to him. He has a kind of traditionalism to him. But at the same time, one of the things that's postmodernism, one of the things that's postmodern about Peterson, I think, is that he often, I think, comes across as saying, you look for your individual meaning kind of wherever you can find it. You find a tradition. Traditions are good for their own sake, but I'm not going to tell you which tradition is the true one or the right one, right? So it maintains a little bit of postmodernism in that the kind of the meaning is kind of its own goal, whereas to a certain degree, if something is going to mean something to me, I have to care about it more than I care about having something that means something to me, right? That might not be clear. So if I go around in the world and I'm saying I'm looking for something that means something to me, and then I find a thing and I'm like, okay, I can kind of care about that a little bit. Um, it hasn't really provided me with the transcendent meaning that I might have been looking for, because the meaning it gives me is kind of subservient to that kind of original instrumental aim of looking for, what can I find that's meaningful. So this is the kind of critique that's launched at Peterson, but I'm certainly not an expert in Peterson or in meaning, really. Still looking for it myself to a degree.
Well,
So.
the why I bring it up, I was just wondering how you think, what are the dangers in going toward meaning without the analytical toolkit? And what are the things that people need to be wary of losing?
That's a good question that I'm going to take a minute to formulate an answer in my head for. I apologize for pausing like this. So I'm not sure I can speak to dangers exactly per se. Um, what I would say is that the value of meaning conflicts to a degree with some of these other, all of these values, meaning and logic and curiosity that I've kind of outlined here, they all, once you have multiple values, you're going to have situations where there are trade-offs. I think the main situation within this group where you saw this is these exchanges that Jordan Peterson had with Sam Harris. I forget, it was like, I don't know if it was 6 months or a year ago now or something. And they were arguing about this idea of truth. Um, and Peterson, it's still not exactly clear to me what his argument was. To a degree, Peterson was just making what's called an evolutionary debunking argument. So an evolutionary debunking argument says, um, well, the best explanation for this concept is that we we evolved to have it, and so we don't need to think that it corresponds to anything real out in the world. Like we don't need to think
And
that
you're speaking
there's
about
anything
meaning.
out in the world that. Sorry.
We've evolved to have meaning, or the search for meaning. Is that what you mean?
Well, in this case, the concept they were arguing about was truth. So Peterson was saying we don't necessarily need to think about truth beyond what's useful for humans. And I do think that there is a danger in that, but I also think it's just wrong. Among other things, uh, to know what's useful for us, we need to know the truth to begin with, right? So we kind of start with the world, and the world has facts about what our interests are and facts about, other objects around us that may be useful in, satisfying those interests in some way. So my interest is in keeping the mountain lions away, and I have a bunch of sticks in front of me. So now it's true that I can make a fire. Um, but we have to start with at least a certain kind of notion of truth,
Okay.
at least a kind of bare bones notion of empirical adequacy, to even start broaching questions of our interests or what's useful in terms of satisfying them. So yeah, I think there is not exactly a danger, but a bit of a discontinuity there. And obviously, Peterson and Harris are, that's the thing about this intellectual dark web is it's interesting how it's kind of picked up figures who are really very idiosyncratic, um, and in a different environment would be, I think, quite opposed to one another, and would be the ones debating against each other. Um, but because there are also these other kind of forces of cultural politics that lump them together, they end
Yeah.
up lumped together and on the same side. I think that's an interesting feature of the current milieu, and I often wonder, where would I be if all this other stuff wasn't going on? And there's a lot of people in these, there's a lot of articles in these, Quillette and Ario and publications like this where I'm like, there's, I could push back against this, I could push back against that. Um, but there's also all the, there's reams and reams of this other stuff that seems to take my attention instead. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting time,
I
in
like what
that
you
way.
brought up about these thinkers that are on the rise right now being very idiosyncratic, and I'm shooting from the hip, but I wonder if whatever it is about the current cultural kind of landscape that actually attacks people who are idiosyncratic to a certain degree or tries to suppress them, tries to blanket over them with the forces of these kind of monolithic ideologies that are clashing right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. I certainly think that, yeah, I certainly think that's correct. And you see this also on on the kind of within the left, there's kind of almost a kind of mini, you might call it a kind of mini intellectual dark web within the left with people like Freddie DeBoer and Angela Nagel, and maybe Jesse Singal would count. Um, and some of the other there's a certain group of kind of pro free speech socialists and anti-identity politics socialists like Adolph Reed you might put in there as well, who's this very left-wing black socialist who's written against Black Lives Matter, who's written in favor of Rachel Dolezal, and some just has taken some very interesting views. Um, and there's kind of the same. I actually think they get it to a certain extent worse than people outside the left. There's a real kind of flattening force out there. What I wish I had a kind of explanation I was confident about the source of this opposition to idiosyncrasy. I think social media plays into it to an extent. I think the relationship between, on the one hand, you have a politics of identity, and on the other hand, you have identity is like a branding consumer kind of thing where identity on the other hand is all about what you buy and so forth. And once you have an identity that is, to an certain extent, we might define identity as the kind of thing that corporations can study and then decide what kind of market niche you're in. So all of these forces are kind of pressing together. Social media plays a huge role. But I don't know exactly what the balance is. I don't know what the largest of the forces are, or if probably I've missed some relevant features there.
I'm listening to an audiobook called The Cave and the Light by Arthur Herman. And
Mhm.
it's kind of a historical narrative that's based on the premise that Plato and Aristotle and their adherents are kind of like going against each other through time and
Mhm.
forcing the progress of Western civilization. And I got to this point in the book where the author writes about Florence in Italy in the Renaissance period. And just to abstract from that, there was all these different successors going against each other and kind of revising the direction of the city. And one of the people who came into power was very puritanical, and he's the one who instigated the Bonfire of the Vanities, where
Mhm.
everybody in Florence just threw all their masks and their costumes in a pile, and then they started throwing more and more cultural products, even like
Uh-huh.
rare manuscripts and these books, and like it just kind of like conflagrated under
Right.
the initiation of a puritanical force. Starts with the stuff that's just surface, which is just like consumerism identity, but then it
Mhm.
starts to erode the more and more valuable forms
Right.
of the left. So I just wanted to put that image
Yeah,
over
that's
what's happening in the left.
that's really interesting. Of course, worth noting in part because he passed away very recently. Tom Wolfe had a book in large part about identity politics. Of course, it was this kind of older iteration of identity politics from I think the 1980s, but still very relevant. A lot of Tom Wolfe's work is called The Bonfire of the Vanities. Yeah, I definitely think there's something there, and obviously I agree with your kind of hierarchy of the importance that it doesn't bother me so much if because of some political thing I have to drink Pepsi instead of Coke or whatever. But if once you start telling me what I can read, if I can listen to Wagner or not or something like that, that's when it starts to really hit me. Um, And I think we're getting into a weird, and not to say anything against, Me Too, I think was to a large extent a justified and necessary movement, but some of the things that are there's some things that have come from it that strike me as simply perverse. The erasing of names from the credits of movies, um, and the deleting of scenes and things like that, and that I think is a sign that maybe we're starting to go. I was going to say deeper into the bonfire, but I guess physically that's not the right metaphor. But you know what I
Or it's
mean.
getting
I
higher
guess
and
I
higher.
guess actually the superficial stuff was at the deepest level because that's what went on first. But
Yeah.
the bonfire is starting to expand, I
Yeah.
guess, in your
And
in your metaphor.
it's a historical. I would even say it's a historical certainty that a cycle such as this, just using Me Too as the case study of something that's very justified needing to happen, and then it gains a momentum of its own, and it goes way out of bounds of actually fixing the situation. It's no longer about finding a solution, if it ever was, but because it was based on calling out a problem, people are just like, well, we're just in this call out kind of momentum,
Yeah,
so we just have to call out all the problems and burn and burn and burn all the problems and stuff. And it's just there's something in the momentum. And I was thinking about with the intellectual dark web, it or any group that ends up forced together under circumstance, such as these idiosyncratic thinkers. They're lumped together and they're defined from outside as being not this other thing, or they're standing
right.
against this other thing. But there's always the danger that they form from the inside as against what's outside them, rather than being
Mhm.
lumped together just by circumstance. They form like a phalanx, and then that cements and calcifies their ability to no longer, even have nuanced discussions amongst each other.
Yeah, I certainly think that's always a danger whenever and this is something that I watch for with myself, and sometimes some days I'm better about it than others. But there's always the danger when you have this kind of oppositional or reactive or maybe even reactionary standpoint, that you're going to be uh, you're going to stop seeing nuance on either side. What I try to This is why I love kind of the heterodox people within the left. I love finding I love kind of making the cross. Uh, I'm losing my words here. I love finding. I love being the crossover and finding somebody in this group who I can actually speak to. I've had mixed success with it, but just in somebody who says, "Oh, I like social justice," and I say, "Well, how about this?" And they say, "Well, I don't know so much." And I say, "Well, how about that?" And they say, "Okay, maybe we're using different terminology, but we're kind of on a case by case basis. We're seeing eye to
Yeah.
eye pretty well." And then you see people within your own group, and you're like, I don't actually think of it that way.
Hmm.
And In a way, that one's harder for me. I think it's harder
Yeah.
to say, especially in an oppositional movement, right?
Yeah.
Which social justice itself, to an extent, is an oppositional kind of, they're opposed to the patriarchy, they're opposed to white supremacy, and so forth. Um, Once you have a kind of big bad that you're fighting against,
Mm.
it's very, there's a lot of pressure not to say, well, look, this argument in your article, it just wasn't a good, it doesn't even, it's not a good argument.
Yeah.
Um, and there's this kind of thing of, okay, you have all these famous people retweeting it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And people are going to look at you like, why are you fighting me? Why aren't you fighting the big bad SJWs, right?
Yeah.
And this is a danger. I think it's a real danger of political engagement. And
Hmm.
it's one of those things about this area, the way I started out saying I was here looking for arguments in the wild, right? It's one of the dangers of this area of the wild that
Hmm.
it has these incentives when you're
Yeah.
participating, that are not present well, not present to the same degree,
Yeah.
in certain other areas of argumentation.
Oppositional, I guess, movements or oppositional forms of dialectic even tend to collapse everything on winning.
Yeah.
And they tend to collapse everybody into a team with one goal. And philosophy doesn't have one goal, or
No, it's certainly not.
maybe even in another way of saying things, and I might be wrong in saying this, but truth isn't in just one place. There's no one single truth. It's always there to certain degrees in a lot of places.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that I think, the our side, if you could call it that, or kind of the intellectual dark web, could be emphasizing more. I think
Hmm.
one really bad effect, because I'm going into academia, and I tutor on the side, I think a lot about teaching.
Yeah.
How am I going to teach? How do I teach? And this thing of curiosity keeps coming back to me.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I think one of the real intellectual weaknesses, especially pedagogically, um, of of these leftist movements is their kind of monomaniacal. Well, you called it monolithic, right? You find this monolith, and then everything traces back to it. So we actually build a really uninteresting picture of the world,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like that's one of the things I think at a basic level, that's probably what bothers me about it the most. You build this picture of the world where everything is caused by the same thing, everything has the same structure, everybody can be analyzed the same way.
Yeah.
Every argument looks the same, every political thing is the same kind of interaction, and every interaction is political. So you don't need any new frames. And I think the intellectual dark web is at its best when it's rejecting that rather than falling into the same trap.
Yeah.
It's at its best when it's saying, look, we've got philosophy. You learn philosophy, and that's a philosophical way of thinking. We've got math. You learn that, and it's a mathematical way of thinking.
Yeah.
You got physics. You learn a physical way. You've got chemistry. You learn a chemical way, right? You've got
Evolution.
art and
Yeah.
literature. You've got all these things, and you learn all these different ways of thinking. And the world is we have so much information right now. We live in such
Yeah.
a colorful world with such diversity of kind of structures and processes and approaches. Um, and Yeah, so the more curiosity, in whatever group is relevant to me, the better, I would say.
There's that quote from John Stuart Mill that I'm going to mess up, where he says that the person who doesn't know the arguments against his position doesn't even know his position that well.
Uh,
Right. So if you only know the strengths of your position and you don't know the weaknesses and you can't admit the weaknesses, you're going to be very weak. So in one respect, the monolithic mentality of reducing everything into some superstructure that then you go and you do your theory on, that makes it very weak. The story is very
mhm.
weak. I don't know if John Stuart Mill necessarily, I think an addendum, if he didn't include it, I don't know if he did, but not only is it weak, but it's not interesting.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly right. And this is one of the very original studies that got me really reflecting on this stuff. I think John Haidt, who I was lucky enough to meet, I guess over a month ago now. But one of the really interesting studies about this stuff is the one where what do they do? They ask liberals and conservatives to write the arguments of the other side or something like that, and it's like,
Yeah.
conservatives can do it for liberals, and liberals can't do it for conservatives. And as a lifelong liberal, that's so disappointing to me.
Hmm.
That seems like the opposite of what we should be. I growing up, I identified liberalism with this curiosity and this open-mindedness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I kind of thought that's what its essence was.
Hmm.
And I think the interesting thing to me is in all of these kind of, I guess you would call them ideologies, there's a kind of a rationale for not engaging the other side. Um, there's,
Well,
you
not
know,
engaging in good faith or not engaging in a way that's dialectical.
yeah, not engaging in good faith and not engaging in a curious manner,
Yeah.
right? Not even reading. So there's, I think many social justice people have this view. Well, we need to know platform somebody because if somebody gets a platform, their ideas will like get into people's heads and like spread, like a disease. I'm not 100% sure that I don't know if ideas work that way. A lot of people are capable of, we should hope at least, maybe on the town corner it's a different idea, but on a college campus,
Yeah.
we should hope that people can listen to an idea and then say, no, that's wrong, and then kind of go about their day, right?
Hmm.
That's like maybe one of the number one skills that you should develop at college.
Yeah.
Um, and but on our side too, you sometimes read these articles about the opposing ideologies where it seems like what's being done is more diagnosis than dialectic.
Hmm.
So by diagnosis, I mean, what are the kind of psychological or political features that would lead somebody to take up such an obviously wrong view,
Yeah.
rather than saying, what is the view? What are the arguments that have been made
Okay.
for it?
Yeah.
Um, and let me go ahead and prove those arguments wrong. And I think part of this is market forces.
Hmm.
In January for Ario, I wrote a piece called "Postmodernism Isn't Playing Around Anymore." So I was trying to write about this. In early postmodernism, in the '60s, for example, Derrida was writing about. He had this paper, "Structure, Sign, and Play," and this whole idea of play and of meanings kind of
Hmm.
floating around and everything kind of floating around and
Yeah.
not meaning anything had this very kind of libertine and almost libertarian feel to it. And I still disagree with it. I think words mean things, and I think the world is the way it is objectively. Um, but it wasn't at all this like scolding,
Yeah.
you know, you only get to do one thing. Let me tell you what this song means because of my,
Yeah.
ridiculous interpretation, based on an event from 150 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so this element of play was lost, and I tried to analyze some early postmodern writings and recent things and tried to propose an explanation for why it was lost. And some of the comments were like, oh no, you're trying to put this postmodernism into my head. And it was a little disappointing. It was a little bit of a downer because it's like you can put it in your head and then take it out again. You
Yeah.
put it in your head, you think about it, you're like, no, then you remove it.
Yeah.
And so that's something that worries me. And I think that's part of, like we were saying, that's part of the fact that it's an oppositional movement, just like the movement that it's opposing is oppositional and it is oppositional itself.
Yeah.
Um, and it's part of the kind of political thing of, well, if we platform the other ideas, then they win, right? If we present them charitably in order to take them down, then just presenting them charitably is already giving them kind of column inches or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bad approach. That makes things worse for everybody.
I wonder if this is just a hypothesis. I wonder if there's something about the Frankfurt School and post-structuralism and what we call postmodernism. There's something about it that can be playful when it's not the majority and when it's working out within a larger structure that it's fighting against. But once it gains a certain momentum, it doesn't translate well at all into the mainstream. For instance, there's this critical race theory stuff, right, which was developed, I think, in in legal thinking and
Yeah.
looking at systemic
Kimberly Crenshaw and so forth.
systemic prejudices and systemic racism and stuff. But once it starts trickling down into the mainstream, you have really ridiculous posts on social media just calling out whiteness as controlling
Yeah.
everything. And you're like, well, that idea worked very well thinking of things, but once it's on an interpersonal level or once it's given up of its nuance. So two things. There's a reduction in translation into just the bumper sticker. It doesn't work
Mhm.
anymore in a bumper sticker. It becomes the exact same thing that it's fighting against, or it was fighting against. And two, once it becomes institutionalized itself, this Marxist kind of thinking or this oppositional kind of theory, it has properties to it like Solzhenitsyn uh, showed. It has properties to it where it becomes the most humanless, most oppressive
Right.
force that there was. It began fighting against oppression, but it doesn't stop fighting against oppression, and therefore it becomes oppressive force.
Yeah, I think there are you're certainly right, and I don't know if I have a full explanation of what's going on there. Um, I think certainly, a little bit of these things, if every once in a while in your interactions you think, oh, like maybe I was, maybe there's an aspect of my conversational partner's identity that I wasn't taking into account,
Mm-hmm.
that I could have done a better job with.
Hmm.
Um, and even if you have a term like microaggression that might not be scientifically right, but you have something to nail that onto, that doesn't necessarily bother me so much. The problem is, as you say, the problem is when it comes to be this totalizing
Mm-hmm.
kind of, you know, microscope for human interactions and for,
Yeah.
kind of human intellectual endeavors and artistic endeavors, where everything now, I was reading a wonderful draft of an article that a friend of mine is hoping to write, or to get published in the Atlantic about the new Victorianism, and he spends a lot of time on these sensitivity readers for novels. Now they have,
Oh my
if you have,
God.
there are professional people who, if you have a black character, you need to have a professional, and it's not like, you can't send it to the black people. There's it has to be a professional, somebody whose profession is, I read this and decide whether or not I'm offended, right? And that
What
there's
the
kind of
fuck?
it's that way, to a certain extent. Many endeavors have something like that,
Yeah.
and I think it has grown and grown, and we haven't gotten to the Solzhenitsyn point of things, luckily.
Yeah.
But it's it certainly has gotten to a point where, as I was saying
Hmm.
before, the diversity of the world, the diversity approach is being just reduced so massively,
Well,
and the diversity of things that we're teaching
yeah.
in college and even in high school,
Yeah.
is being reduced as well.
I wonder
Yeah.
if, even though there's a valid critique of commercialism that you mentioned earlier about the reduction of identity into things that you can accumulate and paste onto yourself. But I wonder if the market itself can't also provide a solution to the problem of like a sensitivity reader. Once you have all these outlets, these official outlets, these really big outlets, putting all this stuff that's so bland out there, people will naturally just get bored with it and go support independent creators.
Yeah, I think
Like
it's a difficult.
Quillette and Arrow
Mhm.
magazine. Like those are like off the beaten path, but they're experiencing phenomenal growth because they're
Yeah.
providing something that people want.
Yeah, I certainly agree. This stuff puts me in a weird position because I'm not. I'm not any kind of free market fundamentalist. I don't have strong beliefs in the market.
Hmm.
I think does a good job of aggregating information, but in general, I believe to a certain degree, uh, in Gatekeepers, I think people should be reading Shakespeare instead of Fifty Shades of Grey.
Yeah.
Um, and so I have
Hmm.
some kind of old-fashioned views on, to a certain degree, elitist views on art and music and on,
Yeah.
on philosophy and writing.
Yeah.
So it's difficult for me because I certainly see, I don't believe the gatekeepers right now I just don't think they're thinking about the right things. I think at many different kinds of institutions, I think at literary institutions, the gatekeepers should be thinking about literary quality. And at, musical institutions, the gatekeepers should be thinking about musical quality.
Hmm.
At philosophical institutions, the gatekeepers should be thinking about philosophical quality.
Okay. Quality.
But my view is that in all of these institutions, more and more they're thinking about politics, and especially this cultural politics. So
Hmm.
I think that the market can definitely solve it to a certain degree by getting all this other stuff out there, but it still leaves you with the 50 shades of gray problem, right?
Well,
Like it still leaves you with the problem, to an elitist like me, it leaves you with the problem that who knows if the market ends up making the right choices anyway. So I think I may,
hmm.
at a certain point in my life coming up, maybe soonish, I may have some difficult decisions to make about, and this is what, when things get oppositional like this, you get into these difficult moments where you're
Hmm.
between, okay, I don't really have this completely positive view of the market, and I don't completely have this positive view of our gatekeepers right now. And,
Hmm.
if I'm writing a book, I'll need to figure out where do I put it? Which route do I take?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I don't know. I don't think there are easy answers um, to that question, and I certainly uh,
Well, I wonder if it's not. I wonder if, like, instead of gatekeepers,
mhm,
gatekeepers is the easiest solution to it until the point where the gatekeepers are corrupted by a variety of things that are subsequent to actual quality, let's say. But if you're cultivating it, I think the responsibility is on the cultivators of curiosity, the cultivators
mhm,
of the thirst for interesting things. If you have a populace who's cultivated, so I think it's educators, need to be cultivating intelligence and showing people that, look, yeah, okay, 50 Shades of Grey, it'll capture your attention and it'll keep your attention, but pay attention to how your attention is modified by
right,
this. Now, let's go over here. This is a little bit more difficult, but pay attention to how your attention is modified when you start paying attention to Shakespeare, right?
right.
So I think the responsibility for, I think the responsibility is more for people, the artists and the musicians to be attractive, just like 50 Shades of Grey, but then do something interesting once people get in the game.
Yeah, I absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I do think that there's, one thing I've complained about with public philosophy is that a lot of it is this like, a lot of it is connected to pop culture, uh, the philosophy of,
The Matrix,
the Matrix, the
The
philosophy of Star
Simpsons.
Wars, the
Yeah.
philosophy of Harry Potter, yeah. Um, and that may just be, uh, that may just be the way it has to be, right? In a
Yeah.
pragmatic sense, it may be that you need to draw people in.
Yeah.
You need to kind of give things to people at various levels. Uh,
Well, isn't that the
and
strength of Jordan Peterson? That's what he does. He captures people's attention, but because he's studied this and really cultivated his own intelligence, there's something behind the really
right.
cartoonish forms. He can break things down and
Yeah, I think, Jordan Peterson is such I don't know, it shows me how, to me, I always see Jordan Peterson, I think, oh, he's a kind of he's an idiosyncratic academic. He has some weird psychological theories. Seems like an okay guy. It's interesting to me. With I guess I'm kind of bringing us back to another topic, but it's always interesting to me the people who get picked as these flashpoints. I can personally, maybe it's just saying something about my lack of understanding of kind of the zeitgeist, but I can never predict a lot of the people who all these controversies erupt around
Hmm.
do not seem to me to be like people with radical personalities or even radical viewpoints
Hmm.
about much of anything. I definitely think Peterson has an interesting way of speaking and his an interesting way of combining narratives with psychology, with
Yeah,
tradition, and so forth. One thing I'll say about again, I'm a little all over the place. I apologize,
that's
but
fine. I enjoy it.
one thing I've been thinking about just today because I saw this recent Will Bruckner maybe he's evolving Moloch on Twitter. Posted another Quillette article where he's responding to a Vox explainer about monogamy. Um, and Will and now Cody Moser published something similar for us at Ario. They're both students of evolutionary anthropology. I think evolutionary anthropology is a great, almost kind of intrinsically Petersonian area where all of the studies are about these intense dynamics in hunter gatherer tribes
Yeah.
and things like that,
Hmm.
and these questions about what were humans like in the African savannah, back in the evolutionary bottleneck in the Horn of Africa. What were humans like in caves? And these stories about the way that humans would interact with each other. And there's something so it's an incredibly compelling field that at the same time has been uh, really pushed out. I think of kind of the broader anthropology. Anthropology these days is quite concerned with social justice.
Justice. Yeah.
The main mode, I
Hmm.
think, at least the most publicized mode is cultural anthropology, um, and the associated cultural studies movement.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so I think evolutionary anthropology, uh, kind of as a field, has that Petersonian thing of drawing people in with these
Yeah.
really
Narratives.
narratives that you can feel,
Yeah.
because you can feel, you know, Will Quill had this article about, or maybe it was a blog post, but he wrote something about rituals of masculinity and like entering into in a tribe, in an untouched tribe, the rituals they have of, telling somebody they're a man, and it really kind of it hits you a little bit. The stories, and it hits at something primal, which shows that they're,
Hmm.
at a psychological level, they're doing really good work in the evolutionary anthropology. So I think that's a field that the more of that we get in this kind of intellectual dark web sector, the better. I think it's an incredibly promising field.
Yeah, with evolutionary psychology, like you're saying, there's no moral filter placed upon. There's no you don't start with judging people's behavior. You start by seeing how that behavior is just a part of how we're woven together. These so-called like negative aspects. With Cody, he brings up a number of things. It's a fascinating article. He brings up selfishness, and he kind of goes against the narrative where hunter-gatherers were all like, "We're going to share everything." It's like, well, no,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
only share what they can't hide, right? So there's always selfishness there. Selfishness is built into us. So with going at that lens, with not calling out people for being selfish, but saying, okay, we're all selfish, but this is
hmm
how we've managed it, and this is how we've leveraged other values against selfishness to create a more and more refined structure. So you don't go through denying the evils of civilization or denying the
right.
evils of man. You're saying, well, this is just how the world is, but this is how we manage it. And by looking at that way, then you can see how you can make more progress by understanding my own compulsions and the compulsions inside of other people, and then seeing kind of different tricks that we play to make the game more playable.
Yeah, and I think there's something. there's something, I guess I can see how to a certain extent this could be viewed as politically conservative, right? Because the idea is basically you have to understand society at a deep level before you're trying to change it, right?
Yeah.
Um, you have to understand why we have the traditions we have. You have to understand what individuals are like, and that's not always great. And you have to understand that much of society,
Yeah.
although it can be cruel and it can ostracize people
Yeah.
and it can kill people and it is founded on a monopoly of violence or whatever.
Mhm.
But you have to understand that it's built the way it is in large part to control the ways that people can hurt each other. Um, and we're
Hmm.
undergoing kind of constant, massive, social experiments.
Yeah.
Everything from Tinder and sex bots. I think Diana Fleischman wrote in Jacobite recently about sex bots. Um,
Hmm.
all that to just these massive CRISPR. We're going to be doing gene editing soon. I have no idea what that's going to do to people's reproductive instincts when you can just say, okay, take this part of me and that part of somebody else and mix them together and put them
Yeah.
with these three other people, and then that'll be our baby. Or I don't know exactly what it's going to be like, but it could be crazy.
Hmm.
And I think you know in my life and in my observation of the technological and cultural changes going on around me, I think I got to a point where I was just ready to say, hold on a second.
Hmm.
Before I go any further, I want to know what's going on. Um, and that is what is it? Is it Buckley, the founder of National Review, who said, the conservative stands athwart history and yells stop. I don't think I'm yelling stop, but it's kind of like, just for a second, just stop for a second so I can even
Yeah.
figure out what all these changes are going to mean for everything. And the funny thing is
Huh.
that in terms of technological progress, it's often political liberals and progressives who are saying stop. They're the ones who say science needs to be done ethically. We need to think about the political ramifications of
Yeah.
all of our research and so forth. Um, and to a certain extent, I'm all for that. What's curious to me is that there's no effort to apply that same or I shouldn't say no effort. There I'm doing it again.
Hmm.
I'm making my opponents into a monolith. There isn't the same sort of visibility given to efforts on the left to say, well, we're changing our culture massively.
Yeah.
We're opening it up in various ways, um,
Hmm.
and we're performing sex changes on children, and we're teaching 18-year-olds about polyamory, and
Hmm.
what's going to happen. I don't know.
Hmm.
And maybe it's just getting old that you start to worry that everything's going to change too quickly. I am 30 now, so maybe I'm around that age. But yeah, I think the beginning point of saying, who are we? Where did we come
Yeah.
from? And evolution is such a powerful tool. It allows you to kind of
Yeah.
to it's just an incredibly powerful tool
It's a
for
wonderful
understanding
glove.
individuals and groups.
Yeah, it's a wonderful glove to put on to reach into the heart of the bonfire and
Yeah,
start turning over the coals down in there.
that's exactly right. And that is, in my just bringing it back to what I study in philosophy.
Yeah.
That is, we do look for very powerful explanations like that, and there is a reason. Like there is a psychological and even scientific reason why, just like evolution is attractive to us,
Yeah.
something like white supremacy or patriarchy or neoliberalism or whatever is attractive
Yeah.
to many people on the political or cultural left. They say this is a very powerful tool for tying together
Yeah. Okay.
a lot of disparate phenomena, right? And this gives us this gives us an
Coherence
insight
and
into all these different
codency.
things,
Yeah.
and we get to put them all together. And that's why I think it's not. That's why I think you need to kind of take them as to whatever degree as possible as people also engaging
Yeah.
in
Okay.
a project of trying to understand the
Yeah.
world. We think they are making mistakes in doing so. Um, and, in many cases, uh,
Hmm.
very grievous mistakes. But, uh, monoliths have this quality that they're powerful explanations. And so it's understand this lack of curiosity I was talking about before. I can modify it a little bit and say it's understandable because you want to be curious, but you also want solutions that give you an insight into to many things at once.
Yeah.
Um, and that is what evolution uh, certainly does.
And the evolutionary, or the evolution narrative, wedded with the analytic rhetoric or process of building an argument. If those two things are wed, then you have a pretty strong matrix that can arrange understanding of life with doing minimal violence, or always checking your steps, always checking your steps. So not it's curiosity in an outward movement coupled with doubt on the inward movement, or like a self-editing and
Right.
checking in with yourself.
Yeah, and I think this relates also we were talking way back about the Peterson Harris argument. Um, the checking yourself analytically is so important because
Mm-hmm.
if you take evolution to explain everything, then you can have this thing of saying, well, we don't need a notion of truth anymore
Okay.
because we just evolved to think certain things are true and certain things are false. And you say, well, that's a little bit, you're just going a little bit too far, right? We
Hmm.
need to make sure we're doing everything in the right order. We need to make sure our concepts are all in line.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the big debates of evolutionary debunking is about morality. Um, so in metaethics, in philosophy, there's this very old debate about the realism or the non-realism of moral facts, right? So uh, is it a fact that some action is right or wrong, or is it just kind of everybody's emotional reaction, or is it
Yeah.
social consensus? Is it some kind of social construction? There's many ways of thinking it isn't a fact, or it is some kind of fact that isn't a moral fact. Um, and the evolutionary debunking arguments go, well, our morality evolved, uh, to help groups survive and
Yeah.
help individuals survive within a group, right? Um, a bit like what Cody was saying in his essay for us. And the evolutionary debunking argument goes, this is a complete explanation of our moral intuitions, right? This comprehensively explains
Hmm.
uh, all of the moral thoughts we have, and so we don't need to say that we need
Hmm.
the idea that morality is correct in order to explain it. And to me and a lot of people, that seems again to be taking evolution just a little bit too far, kind of outside of its proper domain.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's difficult to explain exactly how.
Yeah.
So these arguments have really quite a good pedigree, and there's an active literature about them.
There's
So
the
yeah,
there's
sorry, go ahead.
there's the I'm just going to wander into this trap maybe, but there's this empirical mindset that really wants to to ground itself in what is an observation and in figuring out the correct tools to explain what is being observed. But I don't know if that contains in it for example, the Platonic idea of the good. There's no aspiration in empiricism. There's just an
Mhm.
observation. There's no aspiration. And so it's missing. So maybe we can explain our need for aspiration through an evolutionary model, but that evolutionary model is not going to give us something that's going to really light us up.
Yeah, I mean, it's you get into certain kinds of chicken egg problems, right? So in as I've been saying, when we evaluate it, even in kind of forming an empirical impression, we kind of are already doing explanatory work to begin with, right? So if we say, the cat sat on the mat, well, we already need to have we have several seconds of empirical observations where we're putting together, okay, this all looked the same, so it's probably the same object we're calling a mat, right?
Yeah.
This all looked the same, so it's probably the same object calling the cat, and it took this action that seemed intentional, and we're going to call that action sitting, right? So there's already a lot of explanatory work being done kind of in our basic observational mechanisms.
Okay.
And uh, a lot of the criteria for what counts as a good observation, I'm sorry, what counts as a good explanation
Okay.
are almost aesthetic in a sense. So there's this idea of elegance or simplicity, or parsimony, and
Mm.
this idea of not having too many epicycles, which relates back to the attempts to save geocentrism against the Copernican kind of
Yeah. Okay. Just
Kepler Copernicus events.
simplifying things. The
Um,
Occam's razor kind of.
yeah, exactly. So there's the philosopher W.V. Quine said the real justification for simplicity. He just said, I have a taste for desert landscapes. Um, that's kind of an aesthetic view of what simplicity is.
Is it proper or is it firm enough to make one of your first principles based on aesthetics?
I think it's
Is it
personally.
unavoidable? Maybe.
I think it's so. I was going to say it's what we do.
Okay.
It's the reasoning we've got. It's proven to be uh, very successful for a lot of different kinds of things. Um, I view it as so to a certain degree. I'm a Popperian. I follow Karl Popper, who isn't that popular anymore, but his basic idea of falsification
Yeah.
is one of these big ideas it's just so good. And I tend to view what people do almost within a kind of quasi-evolutionary lens. I think there are two stages for ideas.
Hmm.
There's sexual selection, where you decide how pretty an idea is, and
Yeah.
then there's natural selection, where you try to kill it. Um,
Huh.
and
Yeah.
so, of course, if you kill it, it can't, it can't reproduce. But you know,
Yeah. Huh.
it has to be, if it's unattractive in various ways,
It's never going
it
to take
won't.
off. It's never going to be
It's never going to
replicated.
take.
Yeah.
It's never going to give people what they want to begin with. So that's not going to prosper either. Um, and
Huh.
a goal for like 10 years from now, I want to write a book called Truth and Beauty.
Yeah.
About these are people are always saying there's some connection between truth and beauty, and it's a it's a big topic, but the connection is definitely there, and I think it
Yeah.
has something to do with our criteria for good explanations. And this is another thing, kind of along with curiosity. Uh,
Hmm.
this is another thing I would love to see more of, kind of within the intellectual dark web type group. If you talk to professional mathematicians or professional physicists, people doing intellectual work, they're always using aesthetic words. Oh, this is it's a
Okay.
beautiful proof. Oh,
Yeah.
this is such a lovely experiment that separated out that enabled us to test this.
Hmm.
And they're not, the people who are actually producing this knowledge have no shyness about talking
Yeah.
about kind of the inherent, you know, beauty of ideas, the kind of kaleidoscopic nature of engaging with a lot of them at once, and the uh, just the kind of almost sensual pleasure
Yeah.
of coming up with a good one, or
Yeah.
knocking down a bad one in some way. I think that's something, again, just from the teaching element, and the what are students learning with these monolithic ideas.
Yeah.
I think
What's
talking
the
about
what's the
beauty as a
eroticism of white supremacy for a leftist?
Sorry?
What's the eroticism of white supremacy for the leftists? What's
The eroticism of white supremacy for
why
the
are they
leftists.
attracted? Like you were saying earlier about the leftism is really attracted to ideas of white supremacy. For example, all these different monolithic ideas. What is so sexy about those
Yeah, I think it's
great, grand, oppressive structures?
I think it's it's sexy because it's powerful. Powerful things can be sexy, and it just you get a new datum, and immediately you know what to do with it. You see an interaction and you immediately say, okay, I've got my race, class, gender, bam.
Yeah,
And I think there's a kind of sexiness to that. I think for me,
yeah,
I with Karl Popper, I think what makes an idea sexy is when it's vulnerable.
huh,
I think vulnerability is sexy,
huh,
and so the best ideas are the ones where you can say, uh, all you need to do is this, and the idea will be dead. It should be so easy to kill this idea. It seems ridiculous. All you need is you can disprove it so easily, and then somehow it turns out that that disproof people try and it just doesn't show up.
huh.
An amazing one is I think it's the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox in the history of quantum mechanics, where I think it was Bell did the eventual experiment on this. I'm probably forgetting the history precisely. But they said there's a there's this paradox that quantum mechanics. I think it was about entanglement. Quantum mechanics implies that if you do this here, this thing will happen over here, and that's just ridiculous. Like everybody knows that could never happen. It's just such an insane idea. So this proves a priori that quantum mechanics is making some kind of conceptual error.
Okay, yeah,
And somebody said, "Well, okay, let's test that. It seems so ridiculous. Let's just prove your intuition that this is so ridiculous." And they tested it, and sure enough, this incredibly crazy thing happened, right? And I think that's sexy.
yeah, yeah. This has been an excellent discussion. I should let you go.
Yeah, it was great talking to you.
So
I don't know if it was a little wide ranging. Hopefully it wasn't. Hopefully I wasn't too scattered for you.
I enjoyed it, and I'm sure a large percentage of my watchers will enjoy it. And I'd like to have you on again.
Absolutely, it was a lot of fun.
What's something you're working on in the future, or something next for you? You just
I'm working
pumping
on.
out 5 articles a week or something like that?
I try to write. At the beginning of every week I make this schedule, and I have like, Monday I'm going to write this, and Tuesday I'm going to write this, and Thursday I'm going to write this, and then it ends up being like one article a week pretty
Yeah,
consistently, which is still
that's excellent.
way better than I've been doing, than previous in my life. I'm working on this. So there's a few articles I'm still trying to get placed. One of them is it's hard. As I was saying, I try to address some of these leftist ideas head on. So I wrote this review of this book by Samuel Moyn called Not Enough about human rights and this relation to philosophical ethics.
Okay.
And he kind of thinks human rights is, a little bit of a neoliberal ploy that distracts us from socialist equality, equality of outcome. And it's been very hard to place it because, you know, only leftists have really heard of him.
Yeah.
But then in the leftist magazines, he has a lot of clout.
Okay.
So they're kind of like, we think you're right, but, we don't want him to get mad at us.
Hmm.
So it's been hard to place that. So that's something that that's
Interesting.
something you can see from me pretty soon. Hopefully that'll come out soon. And I've also been working on, I read these two books very recently, one called Fixing Language, the other called Aspiration, two philosophy books. And I've been thinking of trying to do a joint review of them. They're kind of both about, one is about ways we can improve our language, and the other one is about ways we improve our values.
Hmm.
And the book about ways we improve our language, it corresponds to so many kind of bad habits, I think, of the social justice left, of trying to solve disagreement by
Hmm.
by
forming a
by redefining words, basically.
an escape hatch of semiotics or semantics.
Yeah, exactly. The linguistic. Yeah, I don't know if I believe in epistemic bubbles, but I definitely believe in linguistic bubbles. People just saying we're going to redefine. Now mashed potatoes are mashed potatoes plus power. Um, and suddenly you can't even order your food anymore.
Yeah.
So so that's something I'm hoping to publish soon. Down the road, uh, there's a few academic things I want to work on that are probably less interesting. In August, the Chapo Trap House book is coming out for the popular leftist podcast.
Okay.
And I've been meaning for a while to write something comparing their audience to Jordan Peterson's.
Oh yeah.
Because hopefully it'll be a joint review. The interesting thing, I mean, my starting point for it is just they call themselves the dirtbag left, and Peterson is always saying clean your room, right?
Yeah.
So there's the kind of dirtiness and cleanliness. There's a kind of primal level again, at which that hits you, right? I'm trying to think about, and they have similar audiences. Chapo Trap House has been criticized on the left for being largely male audience, being a little misogynistic sometimes.
Yeah.
The podcasters posed with Bill Cosby's star on the Hollywood Walk of whatever,
Yeah.
and got they caught after all the scandals, right? And they caught all this flack for it. There's an interesting thing there about male audiences and dirtiness and cleanliness, and about it's a socialist podcast, and I'm just going to try to come up with something there. So we'll see how I do.
Well, I hope it's sexy and it survives in the natural against the natural reflexive criticism to kill it.
That's always the goal, to stay alive and to be sexy. We all hope to do that.
Yeah.
It was great. It was really great talking to you.
Absolutely, Oliver.
I would be happy to do it again anytime.
Absolutely. Let's do this again. And I'm going to link your Twitter in the description, and a link to one of your articles, or maybe just your collection of articles.
What collection?
You can choose right now.
Let me.
Why don't you email me or message me?
Yeah, I need to update it. I haven't been updating it, so okay. I'll drop you a line.
All right, Oliver.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Have a good day.
You too.